Think about it for a moment. Who brought you to the faith? Who brought you to the Christian faith of the community? Who brought you to this very moment, right here and now? Think about your heritage. What has brought you to this very moment? I say that because as I've talked with people, moved around with people over the last few weeks, I'm amazed at people who have not been cradle Episcopalians and who have come from other faiths or no faith at all, and for some reason they wind up coming to the Episcopal Church. For how long they stay, God only knows, but as long as we're here, let's indeed reap the joys of being in the household of faith. Who brought you here? Who brought you to the faith? I'm reminded of the fact my grandmother was the one who brought us to the faith. My grandmother and my Uncle Al. When my dad got out of the Navy, we moved back to New York City. We finally had some roots for the first time in our life as a family. The first 10 years of our lives, we were bouncing around a lot. The Navy does that to you at times. And we settled in the borough of Queens for 4 years. And in that time, we went to church every Sunday with my grandmother and my Uncle Al. In a 1949 Pontiac. And my uncle needed to go to church by the time he got that started because the choke didn't always work. And in the wintertime in New York, it got a little chilly. And my grandmother would yell at my uncle for cursing in front of the kids sitting in the back seat. And off we'd go to church. Sunday after Sunday. And we went to church, and we went to Sunday school, and then we come back to Grandma's house, where we'd have rolls and buns. And maybe if everything worked out with my uncle, he would take me to the movies. We'd go to the Queens Theater or the Community Theater on Jamaica Avenue in Queens. And we'd watch whatever was coming down for that matinee. We also liked going to the community. It was only 35 cents a pop for kids. A long time ago. But Sunday after Sunday, we would go. And we got into the choir, became acolytes, and still went to Sunday school, went to confirmation classes, were confirmed, all in that little parish church in Queens, New York. And it all started because my grandmother said to my mother, I'll take the kids to church. You and Phil take Sunday morning and be with each other. Who brought you to the faith? We heard in our epistle to the second letter of Timothy, and Paul is saying to the people of God and through Timothy, he says, indeed, be thankful to your grandmother Lois and to your mother Eunice. They brought you to the faith. And be thankful for the fact that you've caught the faith and you're holding on to it now. And do not be afraid of it. And do not be ashamed of it. But indeed, celebrate that as only God can do. Because this is a faith that we celebrate daily. It's not something we really trot out on Sunday, but every day of our lives. And in fact, you've received this by virtue of your baptism and by virtue of the laying on of hands on your ordination to commission you to go and do the work that Christ has given you to do. Timothy, you've been brought to the faith. Don't let us down. Don't be disappointed in the faith, and don't disappoint us. This is what we are about. This is why we gather week in and week out. Not because we're afraid of disappointing anyone, but because we are positively being brought to the faith of Jesus Christ. We sing the hymns, we say the prayers, we receive the body and blood of Christ, and then we are commissioned from this place to go and live into our baptismal covenant, to greet the world that is out there and say very simply, we represent the good news of Jesus Christ. We represent all that is good and positive in all of humanity. That's what we are about, and we want to share that with you. Now, I'm not saying to be overbearing and stand there and tell them how many times you've been born again, or start foaming at the mouth at all sorts of scripture you can quote. That's fine in the study group. But I think it's get lived out the way we indeed conduct our lives. As the Epistle to James reminds us, be not hearers of the word only, but doers as well. It's one thing to hear the words, but if you don't act on it, it means nothing. It's just a little brain candy going on for us. Who brought us to the faith? I like to think that's the same thing we did for our own children, isn't it? And yet each generation has to make its own understanding and its own determination in its own way in understanding how God reaches into their lives. This is what Jesus was trying to remind the disciples. The disciples are walking around with Jesus on this ministry. He's already set his face to Jerusalem. We heard that back in the summer. He's walked through the village, the areas of the Samaritans, and the Samaritans wouldn't talk to him. Why? Because he was going to Jerusalem, the capital of the Jews. He was going to reclaim the capital city for the people of God. He was going to proclaim the good news in spite of the Roman occupation army, in spite of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes who wanted to pull away the faith from the people and make it indeed something that you paid in order to pay. And so Jesus says to the disciples challenge him, increase our faith. It's like a commodity. Increase our faith like it's something we can buy, like a second candy bar at the store, or a new coat, or a pair of shoes. Increase our faith. Increase our wardrobe. We can do this. Just give us a little extra. Jesus reminds us and simply says, increasing in faith, if you had faith as like a mustard seed, and you had that kind of faith, you could say to this mulberry tree, go plant it in the ocean. Now the literalist would sit there and say, oh yeah, that's the kind of faith you have to have. Jesus used a little hyperbole here. He's making fun. He's playing. He's being a little playful with his disciples. The disciples are looking for something that indeed only they can find. The disciples are trying to challenge Jesus. They really don't want to put a lot of effort into this faith stuff. If Jesus will keep pouring it on, they'll keep taking it in. They'll soak it up like a sponge. And then they can walk around people and say, I got the faith and you don't. We know people like that, don't we? They profess and call themselves Christians. And then Jesus challenges and said very simply, he said, this is not what faith is about. He said, faith is like a slave that's been working out in the field all day or working with the sheep, and he comes in and he says to the master, Master, give me some good food to eat. Give me my slippers and bring me my robe, and let me just relax here. Jesus says, is that what the slave does? And the disciples are left scratching their heads saying, no, that's not really what happens. He says, no, it doesn't. He said, the slave comes, even though he's tired and working all day, he will wait on the master. And then after the master is eaten and he's cleaned up, then the slave can sit down and eat. He said, do you understand that? He said, you're doing the basic thing that the master has asked you to do. Nothing more and nothing less. Now the disciples are left scratching their heads entirely. All they wanted was to be given faith. Just dole it out here. We could take it. And it said, Jesus is challenging them and saying very simply, he said, faith is not a commodity. Faith is what comes deep within inside. Remember we talked about that last week? People live on the society and live in their faith and it's always on this one plane, on this one level. The challenge is when you come down inside. The challenge is to be obedient to the voice that God is calling each and every one of us to do. And recognize the fact, where is your faith to come from? I heard a woman once tell me her life of prayer comes down to a very simple thing. She says a very simple prayer every day. She says the Lord's Prayer. That's all I say. That's my prayer life. She says I say it and I think about all the people that I've known and loved in this world, people that have gone in this world that I no longer will see, and people that I know that I'm praying for, even my enemies. When I finish saying my prayer, that's my prayer life. It's a very simple prayer life. It may not be the right thing either, Father, but this is what I do. Back to basics. I remember my grandparents kneeling down with me, saying my prayers with me as a child. The first trip we were in New York when I was a little guy. We're reminded of that as we gather as the people of God. We're reminded of what our faith truly can be. Excuse me. It's the gift that is given to us by God himself. It's a gift that's given to us as we look inward in order to bring that outward. To understand the fact that as being doers of the word, we are celebrating God in our very midst. And not to be embarrassed, and not to be ashamed, but to indeed understand the fact that we are called by Christ to live into our baptism. What does that mean if not to share the gospel in the world outside those glass doors? It's easy to talk about Christ in here. We're all pretty much converted. We're all pretty much agree to the fact that we like being in the Episcopal Church, at least for the next 25, 30 minutes. We like the fact also, as we're sitting here, as you're listening to this homily, thinking about, who was it that brought me to the faith? Where were my best moments I had in church? For some of you, maybe only one. What was that moment like? What did you come to celebrate with that? Was it the music? Was it the particular prayer? Was it the minister who reached out to you? Was it the people of God that gathered and welcomed you? That's what we come to celebrate. And that's what we do week in and week out. This is what Paul is trying to remind Timothy. This is what Jesus reminds the disciples, and by extension, you and me together. We indeed reach out as only God can do. We celebrate God in our very midst. We celebrate that sense of being in the part of the holy. And we recognize the fact that our faith is something more than just something on the surface. That indeed delves into the very soul of who we are, our very being. Understand the very mystery of what Christ can do in your life and in mine. That's why we gather. And that's why we ask God to increase our faith. But not as a commodity, but as a way of life. the way we conduct ourselves, the way we indeed engage one another as people of God, not only within this community, but outside this community as well. That we're not embarrassed enough to say to someone, would you come and be a part of my faith? Come to church with me. Church surveys will show that people are not attracted by great doctrine or great preaching or great music, but they're attracted by someone who will sit there and say very simply, I really enjoyed going to church on Sunday. Would you like to come with me? I like to entice it even further. I'll say to people, please come to our church. I'll buy you a cup of coffee afterwards. Some of you have been here because of that. Coffee's pretty good. You've stayed. That sense of faith is what we are about. That sense of family is what we are about. That sense of community is what we are about. That sense of who we are by living into our baptism and not being embarrassed by the faith is what Paul reminds us of to be as a people of God. We can do no less as we continue our journey in faith. And maybe we will have a cup of coffee at the end of the service. Or maybe it's just the fact that we can hold on to that memory of people that brought us to the faith. I can still see us getting into that Pontiac, and my uncle cursing and swearing at the car, and my grandmother yelling at him, and the three of us in the back seat thinking, this is what the people of God is all about. And then getting to church and being like everybody else as you walked in and you heard the music, you heard the prayers, and received the body and blood of Christ. What better place to be on a Sunday morning than to be here with the people of God, having our faith strengthened, our loyalties confirmed, and the people of God gathered in God's most holy name. Can't ask for anything better than that. Amen.